If you're an endurance sport fan nut like myself, you had an absolute field day yesterday. We had the final stage of this year's Tour de France happening, but even more importantly, we had the Zwift Tri-Battle Royale, Jan Frodeno going head-to-head with Lionel Sanders, an absolutely unbelievable event and really, really awesome to watch where human physiology can be pushed to and the extent that the human body can work at. So without any further ado, let's jump into my reactions, or a sports scientist reacts to the Tri-Battle Royale. A couple of things I picked up, a couple of the interesting things that I want to chat about, and ultimately just talk about the unbelievable feats these athletes went to produce some unreal race times in what were some testing conditions. So without any further ado, let's get into it. Hey, welcome back to the channel. Nick here, making sports science simple, and in this video I'm reacting to the Tri-Battle Royale. We've put on this awesome event. If you didn't see it, you probably saw it all over social media. For most people, if you're not into triathlon, I think it's definitely worth going through and having a look up what was happening in this event, because it's one of the most unbelievable endurance performances from two athletes, but particularly from Jan Frodeno in the end, who broke the long course Ironman, if you like, world record, absolutely obliterated it. I think the previous world record stood at about 7 hours and 35 minutes. He's come through with a final time of 7 hours 27, and at stages throughout the event, he was on track for like 7 hours 20 and 7 hours 21. So unbelievable. For those who aren't initiated, who might be coming from cycling or running, who watch the stuff on my channel, we're talking about 3.8k swim, 180k bike, and then a marathon run back to back to back in terms of the Ironman format. They obviously had some considerations, and that's what I'm going to take you through my thoughts on the swim, break down the bike, and then have a look at the run as well. I'm not going to go into the ins and outs of the data. Obviously, some of that hasn't been fully released, and I took as many notes down as I could during, and I watched basically the entirety of the event yesterday in bits and pieces. Obviously, we went quite late here in Melbourne. We're in lockdown, so I could stay up till sort of half past midnight or almost 1 a.m. watching the finish of both of these guys. So it was the type of thing that I took as many notes as I could, but we're going to go through the key things that I think are the big takeaways from this event. So let's start with the swim. Obviously, this is probably the part from an Ironman perspective and from a triathlon perspective that most people, when I say probably, don't care about as much. For a lot of people racing, it's just to tick the box. And I guess with the swim, we probably didn't expect too much, and most people didn't expect too much to happen here, other than basically Frodeno coming out ahead of Lionel. It was just a case of what the gap would be. Ultimately, Lionel came out pretty well. And in terms of the swim that they had set up there, it was a lake-based swim, so we know that there's not going to be much in terms of a current or anything to do with that. They had a pontoon start, so not a beach start, so it was a nice clean entry into some deep water straight away. And it was a two-loop course. But the interesting thing that I want to chat about around what made this sort of an interesting swim, not that the times were sort of crazy fast. I mean, Frodeno, having a look up on my notes here, 45:58 was his, I guess what they were reporting as his race time, which is an average pace of about 1 minute 12 per 100 meters, which is crazy fast in the open water. And Sanders at about 50 minutes, pretty much exactly 5 minutes behind him in the swim at an average pace of about 120. What made this interesting in terms of the swim, though, was the lacking need to actually sight a buoy or have someone at the lead of the race in terms of like someone on a paddleboard in front, because they set up this like underwater cable underneath the water that basically acted as like a black line in the pool. If you think about swimming up and down the pool, you can generally swim pretty straight because you've got a reference point. Normally in the open water, you don't have this, so you might be zigzagging all over the place. And ultimately, this little line that they've put underneath, I think, is an interesting technological innovation in terms of open water swimming. And ultimately, it is going to help you swim on a dead straight line because you've got something to follow underneath you. You're not looking up all over the place and relying on your ability just to swim a straight line. You've got a reference point. So I think that was an interesting addition. Obviously, it then comes into, well, does that make it unfair compared to our normal races where we don't have that? They did certify this race and they are claiming it to be the world record over this distance. So be interesting to sort of see how maybe that comes out in the future in terms of people trying to break this record now. Do they need to have these considerations for our professional athletes in things like Ironman or challenge branded events? Obviously, this event wasn't a particular brand. It was just on its own, a standalone. So sort of interesting. But I think that innovation there, and that I guess that can be our interesting technology for the swim, was having a cable underneath. So it made it a bit like a pool swim in a lake, not much current, fairly deep water, I'm assuming, but you could follow a line, which, even though there were some turns and it was a two-loop course, probably does make it a lot quicker because the consideration is there. You don't have to look up to sight, so you're not breaking your normal stroke rhythm. Yes, you're having to turn around a couple of times, but it's, for the most part, you can just jump in and swim in a straight line, keep your head down, you can be as quick as you like. That does lead to be a little bit faster and a little bit different to a normal open water swim. So heading into the bike, we had about a 5-minute gap. Everyone sort of knew that Frodeno was probably going to be up by about 5 minutes, but going into the bike, we then need to look at, well, the course was a five lap course on a freeway. It was predominantly flat. So we know this is going to be a fast, and really this race, let's be realistic, was set up to try and break the world record. So we're always going to have some speed around this course. There were a few little incline sections, and we could see that in the data across the race. You would see either guy were putting out significantly higher power than the other for much lower pace. It's just going through the little uphill and little downhills naturally on freeways and things like that. You're going to have those little undulations that you can't help. But it was sort of interesting to see that both guys held about 45 to 46 kilometre an hour average. So we ended up with Frodeno doing about a 3-hour 55, which is an insane bike split. Sanders a little bit slower in terms of pace at about 4 hours on the dot, but crazy fast over the 180 Ks. A couple of interesting things to talk about from a bike perspective was obviously the banked velodrome-like U-turn at the end of the course. So instead of taking that traditional U-turn where you might have to slow all the way down, the guys are coming in at pretty quick speed. I think Sanders nearly went up over the edge of it on his first one. Frodeno went through a couple of times in the aero position. Really interesting way of setting up the back end of course. Obviously, that's going to save you a lot of time. You're not having to slow right down, basically do a complete stop and do a traditional U-turn. Rolling around this sort of looping velodrome style turn and banked turn is obviously going to be a lot quicker. So I don't think it was necessarily just a gimmick that they put in. It was clearly there to enhance the speed of the turnaround. They did have at the other end of the course a bit more of like a roundabout style as well. So you get a little bit better flow. You're able to maintain a lot more speed, don't have to brake as much. The interesting thing around that though was it was quite wet. So I think that was a bit unpredicted. They had some pretty ordinary weather. It wasn't super cold and it wasn't raining sideways. There wasn't actually much wind by the looks of things. It was largely just a little bit wet. So they were talking throughout the race, the commentary in particular around the possible use of some wider tyres. I don't know whether each of the guys use that in their setups. Maybe some lower tyre pressure to get a better grip on the slightly slippery and wet roads. Definitely made it a bit of an interesting one, but I don't think it impacted any of their speed. So largely, we had some pretty good race conditions, which ultimately led to some pretty impressive speeds there. And very similar to the swim, we ended up with a gap about 5 minutes. Sort of continue to open up as that result of Frodeno being that little bit quicker, about 1k an hour quicker on average across the 180k. So heading into the run after T2, really, we got about a 9.5, almost 10-minute gap between the two guys. At this point, I sort of was pretty convinced that the race was already won. It was just a case of how fast both of them were going to go and carry it onto the finish. But nonetheless, some pretty impressive times. Interesting few things I want to talk about, and both on the same lines. Interesting tech that came out of the bike component of the racing was the use of, I believe it's Super Sapiens is the company, not 100% sure, but that is a key sponsor of Frodeno, a key sponsor of the event, so I'm assuming it's them, using a carbohydrate monitoring tool. So basically it's just this patch that sits on the arm, uses like a little filament or a little needle, if you like, to measure blood glucose live. And this is an interesting thing that they put up during the coverage. You could see their live blood glucose readings, but also for the athletes to have it in potentially their head units on the bike, potentially allows them to time nutrition a bit better. I know given that it was a bit wet and a little bit cooler on the bike, I think about 16, 17 degrees they were reporting in terms of ambient temperature. That means they're probably burning through a little bit more carbohydrate than normal, one, to keep themselves a little bit warm, but also just to power that insanely quick speed. For most part, they're averaging over 300 watts, which is basically my VO2 max watts, so a huge amount of power. They need a lot of energy. But interesting that they were monitoring, and I guess that's a new innovation in terms of the technology space. Is it something that maybe filters down to amateur athletes? I think at some point it does. It's not available in every country so far, this tech. I had to do a quick bit of research of it this morning, and not everywhere is able to access this technology and this, I guess, method of measuring blood glucose live throughout an event. So it will be an interesting thing to see. Does this continue? Is it something that's actually worthwhile measuring? I don't know whether they're either using the data on the day, whether the guys on course are actually using that to manipulate their nutritional strategies. Unsure. They kept on the coverage talking about stability in this number, which I understand is going to be the key metric we are looking at. How stable is that blood glucose sitting along? Are we having any drops? Are we having rapid spikes? We probably don't want to have either of those. If we're starting to plummet in blood glucose, we're probably starting to hit maybe the wall and starting to bonk a little bit. If we're having spikes, we're going to chew through our carbs a bit quicker. So it's probably useful data. It'd be interesting to see where this space goes. Let me know in the comments down below what your thoughts are on measuring blood glucose live and whether you'd be interested in it. Have you had any experience in terms of some crashes in races because of, when I say crashes, blowing up in races or hitting the wall, if you like, because of reduced blood glucose and burning through your carbs, so pretty much by partway through the race. Let me know. It might be something interesting that we continue to look at on this channel. We start looking at the evidence and science behind this methodology or this technology evolving in terms of the endurance space. I think it could be really interesting, particularly for the professional level, maybe also for the amateur level at some point. Be interesting to see where this goes. So ultimately, at the end of the bike, we had that sort of 9.5, 10-minute gap, as I mentioned before. And heading into the run, again, very similar to the bike, we had a multi-lap course, a 4-lap odd course, very, very flat, tiny little bits of false flats in there, but predominantly a very flat, fast course. And again, this is where we saw some pretty impressive times. So Frodeno obviously went through in about 2 hours 44, just over, with an average pace of about 354, 355 thereabouts. And Sanders a little bit slower, 249. So both guys have gone sub 250 effectively in their marathons at the end, which is a pretty impressive time. And that 249, almost 250, goes at about 4-minute pace in terms of minutes per K. So incredibly quick times. And I guess the interesting things to look at here was the significant difference in heart rate. And this was the first part of the coverage that actually showed their live heart rates. We'd previously only been seeing speed and power, blood glucose. We hadn't been seeing so much, and cadence as well on the bike they were having a big emphasis on. We haven't seen so much what their heart rates were doing. And this is the big difference between these two athletes, and they're putting out very, very similar speeds at this point in time where we saw their heart rate. Frodeno was sitting, both putting out that sort of 350, 345 pace at the beginning of their marathons. Frodeno had a heart rate of about 140 beats per minute, headed up to about 145, whereas Sanders had a heart rate of about 120. And everyone knows in the endurance space and the triathlon industry that Sanders has a crazy low heart rate. But it's interesting when we got some more information around what their estimated maxes are or what their tested maximum heart rates are. Frodeno can get up to about 195, whereas Sanders' max heart rate is about 165. And really the key difference between this, we've talked about on this channel before, is the difference in the size of the heart. How much blood can we pump out per beat is going to dictate how frequently it needs to beat. And ultimately, we just have an anatomical and genetic training size of the heart difference between these two guys. Sanders can pump out more blood per beat, much higher stroke volume, so he doesn't have to beat as often to get very similar cardiac output, whereas Frodeno has to beat a little bit more frequently, slightly smaller heart, both leading to the same output. That's that individual difference, and that's where it's really, really critical from a training perspective that they know their individualized training zone. Sanders goes out and runs at 120, 125. Frodeno will be running out at 140, 145 when he's training. So by using each other's zones, if we swap them around, they're in completely different parts of their physiology. So that's where it's really, really important, even at the top end, all the way through the amateurs, that you know specifically where your physiological thresholds are and what your heart rates are according to where you're at overall. And the little individual differences between you versus someone else can actually look like a lot of a difference on paper, but really it's just bringing you back to how do you make up that intensity overall. Last little bit in terms of the run, interesting tech that we saw. Obviously, the difference between Sanders was in the Nike shoes, Lionel's in the Hoka shoes. Are they both equally as good? Is one better than the other? I don't think this is probably the time to talk about the difference in them. I don't think it was really necessarily a fair advantage. We've got two very different running techniques. One guy who sort of crashed a little bit and bombed a little bit towards the back end. In terms of Sanders, Frodeno was able to hold it on for most of the way. He also had a slip on the carpet, which landed on his left hip. Fell down pretty badly, was limping a little bit, then got back into his running. So that might have impacted his running gait a bit. I don't think either shoe is necessarily a bad option. Obviously, a lot has got to do with the sponsorship aspect and who's sponsored by who. Frodeno's sponsored by Hoka, so he's of course going to wear that shoe. But I think it's interesting that other companies are starting to produce equally fast shoes. We have two guys who've gone really in the 240s, sub 250 marathon end of the spectrum, wearing two different shoes, two very different running gaits, but they still can get to that same output. So I think at that point, I think we're starting to see the technology evolve across multiple brands. Previously, when the Nike shoes first came out, the 4%ers, it was kind of Nike's owning this market exclusively, and they're the only ones producing a super fast shoe. Now I think some of the other brands are starting to catch up, and we're going to see in races a little bit closer with similar, I guess maybe Kona is a good example, similar level athletes or athletes running side by side, whether they're winning or sort of mid-pack, we might start to see at that professional end some of these shoes actually performing equally as good as each other, where previously the Nike shoes were miles ahead because other companies hadn't caught up yet. So at the end of the day, what do we have? We had, like I said before, Frodeno 7:27, 53 total time, sets the new world record, absolutely unbelievable, obliterated the old previous record and wins by about 15 minutes. So he held another 5 or so minute advantage on the run. So 5 minutes on the swim, 5 minutes on the bike, and 5 minutes on the run thereabouts. And takes out the win by about 15 minutes, with Sanders coming in at 7:43 thereabouts. So unbelievable event. It was awesome to watch. If you're an endurance nerd like myself, you sort of got heaps out of it. It was great. Some of the people they brought on the coverage to talk about what was going on, talking about things like aerodynamics, the physiology behind it, bringing in athletes from other sports and their insights was really, really cool. What was the most exciting or interesting thing that you took out of the event if you watched it, or something that you've listened to in this video and you want to talk about further? Let me know in the comments down below. Really excited about the discussion that came out of this. Hopefully you enjoyed this sort of reaction style video as well. If you want to see more of these, let me know in the comments as well. So I've talked quite a bit. Hopefully you got a bit out of this. It was a really awesome event to talk about, and we'll see you in the next one.